This is Brian, ScreenFiles.com in review. What I'm looking at today is 2022's Hellraiser, directed by David Bruckner. And this is a movie I wanted to love a lot because what it does is bring the visual stylings of David Bruckner. As a director, he's done things like The Ritual, which is currently on Netflix and is very good, as well as other things such as, most recently, The Night House. And a franchise that I think was well due for a craftsman of his nature. If you look at certain aspects of Hellraiser, it is exceptional. First off, you have the atmospheric music of Ben Lovett, who takes Christopher Young's original soundtrack and repurposes key aspects of it so that it sounds new, yet very evocative of Hellraiser. And that's important because the music is part of what makes Hellraiser as interesting as it is. And you have the cinematography or photography of Eli Bourne, which has resulted in very sharp, attractive images. The color palette is almost monotone. Not a lot of color, but the images are very clear for the most part. It gets kind of, I want to say muddy, but that's not quite fair. It gets very, somewhat dark. I think that's better. It gets somewhat dark, I want to say midway through. And while it's always clear enough to see what's going on, it would have been better if it were a little better lit. Because I would have liked to have seen some of the creatures, by which I mean the Cenobites, a little more clearer. And speaking of the Cenobites, the role they typically play in Hellraiser has somewhat changed in that they're supporting players once again. Even Pinhead is a supporting character. If you recall Hellraiser 1 through 4, it's all about Pinhead. That equation, by my reckoning, has shifted somewhat. And the Cenobites are more supporting characters, which is fine. I have no issue with that. What's particularly odd for me is that the appearance of the Cenobites, not including Pinhead, is oftentimes very similar. And I also get the feeling that of the Cenobites you see on screen, some of them are exclusively computer generated. Some of them just don't feel right. Part of it, I think, is due to the way they're shot, which in some instances is quite distant. So the camera is not close to them. So with the muted color palette and somewhat dark photography, I get the feeling they're just not actual things in some instances. And that's a pity because the Cenobites, visually speaking, are the most interesting part of Hellraiser typically. And here, they're not so much. Though my greatest problem is that Hellraiser fixes things that aren't broken. As opposed to making a really good Hellraiser movie based on the lore that already exists, for some weird reason, the producers decided to change the way certain things work. And by which I'm referring to the limit configuration. In this version of Hellraiser, there are 5 different combinations. In the prior movies, the combinations weren't something that was stressed at all. Well, I mean, sometimes they would, like the triangular shape. But on the whole, that was not the emphasis. And the limit configuration existed only to open the doorway for the Cenobites. Here, it plays a more significant role. And I'm trying to understand it. The movie opens in a club and there's a young person, well, mid-20s young, I assume. And he's being brought to meet someone who we come to learn is named Roland Voigt, who is a very rich person who I assume has nothing at all to do with the boys. And he gives them the lament configuration. But it's not the lament configuration we typically know. It's got the ends that look like the puzzle box, but it's very elongated. And he begins to meddle with it. It cuts him, and chains pull him away. Voigt vanishes after that moment. Now, a weakness of the story is that you know Voight he's somewhere. He vanishes from the movie, but he is clearly still about. That's fairly obvious. And then we come to meet Riley, who lives with her brother and his boyfriend, as well as a roommate. And Riley has had addiction issues, and she's dating someone who her brother does not trust. Riley's boyfriend gets her caught up in a theft he's planning of something. He doesn't know what it is, only that it's potentially valuable. She goes along with him, and what they discover is the lament configuration, as we typically know it, which is to say, a cube. And so she starts to meddle with it eventually, and a blade comes out of it. Now this is the unnecessary part, though this is how I interpret it. The blade cuts the person whom the Cenobites are going to claim. Though to configure the lament configuration to cause it to appear means that you're also opening the door a crack for the Cenobites, which is to say they aren't present in our world, but they can peek through. And so Riley's meddling around in a drug-addled haze, and the blade comes from the configuration. Though it misses her, it doesn't cut her at all. Though she starts seeing visions of the Cenobites. As I said, complications the movie didn't need. Her brother is concerned because she hasn't returned home, and he goes in search of her and finds her on a playground with the configuration. He accidentally cuts himself, and the Cenobites take him. So Riley's entire purpose is initially to try to get her brother back, because he's vanished at this point. She doesn't know where he is or what's happened to him. So after a point, it is to save herself and her remaining friends. Story-wise, it's not atypical from other Hellraiser movies, except that this was written as a Hellraiser movie. Quite a few of the Hellraiser sequels were not actually Hellraiser stories initially. They were adapted to be Hellraiser stories, but they were initially worked out to be something else. This is not that, and it's welcome. Though, as I'm implying somewhat strongly, I think, it's not a particularly innovative story. And the way they changed the lament configuration is confusing to me, in that I don't know why they did it. It doesn't make the story any better, and as I said earlier, it complicates it, and it makes it a little more confusing. So I didn't like that. Another thing I didn't particularly like was that there are, in this mythology, 5 combinations to the lament configuration, with names like Lament, Lore, Leviathan, Lazarus. Why is this being added? It just complicates things once again. And so, this is not the most successful of reboots by my reckoning, because it makes it more confusing. If you were unfamiliar with Hellraiser prior to this, it will probably hold you in good stead, because it is gory at points, and you weren't familiar of how things were prior, so it doesn't appear to be a change to you. It is new, by definition. Though if you've followed Hellraiser to any degree, as I have, I've seen all of them at this point, it is just extremely disappointing. Once again, it's not badly shot. It's well directed. It's very well acted. In fact, this is probably one of the best Hellraiser films in terms of the way it's acted. It's taken very seriously, and there's no camp to be found anywhere. But at the same time, it's not quite Hellraiser either. And that's a bit of a pity, because as someone who has enjoyed the Hellraiser movies, even with their flaws, I was expecting something more faithful, but also just better. And this is one of the few Hellraiser movies with Clive Barker as a producer. He directed one, and I believe he was an executive producer for 2, 3, and 4. Though I think the role he's probably played on this one is greater than in the past, I also think it just does things it doesn't need to do. So what do you think? This is Brian with screenfiles.com in review. If you agree, disagree, let me know down below. And as usual, consider a like or a follow.